That was an incredible introduction, and I hope it's the last introduction where I hear ratemyprofessor.com ever referred to. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors, and I spent the day in the library, the incredible library here, and we'll spend tomorrow in the library, and so I also want to thank the staff there. They've been really extremely accommodating and hospitable. And as was mentioned, this is a perfect weekend for me to come here and talk about the book. I couldn't resist coming to Mount Vernon, of course, to talk about public memory of the private lives of the Founding Fathers, and particularly on this weekend, it being Valentine's Day and also President's Day weekend. Is the microphone okay? Yeah. Okay. As was mentioned, I'm an historian of sexuality and gender in early America, and I have a particular focus on men and masculinity. And so I think, like many historians of early America or other historians, I'm especially interested in how popular culture depicts our time period and our subject, and that brought me to look at sexuality and gender in the tellings of the Founding Fathers' lives. Before I started the project, I certainly had an awareness that we tell stories about the sex lives of the Founding Fathers. And so I was certainly aware that there are stories about Benjamin Franklin, for example. I wasn't too sure what I knew beyond that, and I also didn't know if this just wasn't sort of a current day phenomenon or if there was a longer history to it. And so I started reading back in time in popular sources, especially popular biography as it got through the 19th century. And I saw and was quite surprised to see that even through the 20th century, through the 19th century, and back to their own lifetimes, there was indeed a lot of public discussion of their private lives. Because I am interested in biographies and how we tell life stories, I organized the book in a particular way. So rather than moving chronologically with everybody through time, as you might in a cultural history, I focused each chapter on one individual. And so there's a chapter on Washington, which appropriately starts the book. There's one on John Adams, on Jefferson, on Hamilton, Franklin, and the book ends with Gouverneur Morris. Parson Weems, there we go. Parson Weems, who originated the cherry tree myth, argued about Washington, for example, that we should look to his private life to understand his greatness. Weems argued that public character was no evidence of true greatness and called for Washington's image to be thrust back into the shade of private life. It is not then, he argued, in the glare of public, but in the shade of private life that we're to look for the man. Private life is always real life. As I read and examined the culture of previous generations, one of the many things that surprised me is just how old the tradition is of saying that one is the first to peel back the curtain and look at private life to get at the real man behind the marble myth. I was especially surprised that even in the early 19th century, people were already claiming this as a way to engage readers. And of course, we can see private life in portraits as well as popular print sources. The stories that circulate about private life become a way for people to believe that they're understanding the real man. I think this makes it possible for different generations to feel a sense of connection to founders by understanding them as flesh and blood. In my area of focus, which is intimacy, romance, sexuality, in order to accomplish this connection between 18th century founders and Americans from later generations, the men have to be repackaged for that generation's tastes. So in a broad sense, in the book, we see trends that the men are generally domestic in the 19th century, psychologically healthy in the early 20th century, and today they seem to let it all hang out. But the stories about the founders are, of course, never just about those individuals. One of the reasons that I find the cultural depictions of the founders to be so compelling is that they also represent the nation. And so when we talk about their private lives, the assessments that are drawn, be they of extraordinary virtue or of hypocrisy and vice, those characterizations bring forth a certain assessment of our American experiment and of our national identity. The stories take on symbolism beyond the individual men. Who are we as a nation? Are we free-spirited, virtuous, exploitative, corrupt, deeply loving? We see ourselves in the stories we tell about their private lives because these are stories about our roots. I thought that what I would do with this time tonight is share with you some brief portions of the book to give you a sense of my approach and some of the stories that it contains, let me first start with a brief passage from the introduction that says a little bit more about a couple of points that I've raised. As the founders passed from life into memory, their public reputations lay entirely in the hands of Americans. The sexualized political climate of the early republic waned. By the 19th century, public memory of the founders struggled to reconcile Victorian modes of sexual morality with the elite sexual cultures from which the founders came. The earliest biographies written about the founders seek to establish a permanent respectability for the individual political leaders of the revolution and nation's founding. In the hands of biographers, many of the founders serve as role models for American boys and men. To accomplish this goal, of course, life details are handled carefully, because many of today's most revered founders suffered from early scandalous reputations. Franklin was branded as immoral. Abolitionists labeled Jefferson a child rapist, and Gouverneur Morris's private life had to be whitewashed for Victorian audiences. The sexual revolutions of the 1920s and the 1960s breathed new life into sexual and romantic details of the founders' lives. Throughout the 20th century, sexual desires increasingly became viewed as a psychologically healthy part of a man's life. As the writings of Sigmund Freud and others made their mark on American culture, sexual expression has become an important part of being normal, and the founders are no exception. In addition to being ever more sexually explicit, American memory also yokes nationalist concerns about domesticity to our image of the founders, and writers push ever harder to depict the founders as exceptionally happy in their marriages and homes, despite the lack of hard evidence to support such claims. In the 21st century, we have seen best-selling books about the founders and a renewed interest in the moral and virtuous exceptionalism of the founding generation. A changing political and demographic world has increasingly made the founders, many of them slave-owning, elite white men, seem irrelevant. But Americans have in part used sex to relate to them and connect in a way that parades itself as universal. From museums to political stump speeches, the Founding Fathers are as publicly prominent now as they ever have been. American memory in this moment uses sex to connect 18th century men with contemporary audiences and contemporary concerns. Jefferson, for example, in many circles has emerged as a multicultural hero. Washington is seen as a virile father, and Morris and Franklin are considered delightfully modern in their approach to sexuality. As I mentioned, the changes that I see occurring are largely about repackaging or recasting the ways we talk about their private lives. And I say this because very often writers are using the same sources over generations and yet coming up with very different characterizations. Indeed, it's relatively rare that we end up with dramatically new evidence that comes to light to change our understanding of the private life of a founder. Very often we're left with their papers or early writings, and even more often writers have to draw on family lore and early undocumented stories and legends. Let me share with you one example that looks at how one writer used a passage from John Adams's diary to tell a story of heartbreak. In this passage, I compare what was written in a compelling manner with what we have from John Adams's diary, in which he talks about an early crush on a young woman named Hannah. If we compare two moments from Adams's diary with the author's interpretations, we can begin to see how the relationship with Hannah developed from something left out of many earlier accounts to a love and loss of high order. The author describes a scene where Adams and Hannah were alone. Quote, "John leaned toward Hannah, breathing her delicate perfume, lost in the liquid depths of her tantalizing eyes. The words of love and commitment were on his lips." The actual diary passage is much less romantic, including no references to perfume or liquid depths. It reads, and I think you'll see why it was dressed up as it was. It reads, "Accidents, as we call them, govern a great part of the world, especially marriages. Sewell and Esther broke in upon H and me and interrupted a conversation that would have terminated in a courtship, which would, in spite of the doctor, have terminated in a marriage, which marriage might have depressed me to absolute poverty and obscurity to the end of my life. But the accident separated us and gave room for Lincoln's addresses, which have delivered me from very dangerous shackles and left me at liberty, if I will but mind my studies and make a character and a fortune. According to the author, the experience was heartbreak for Adams, and it pushed him to focus more intently on building his law practice. Indeed, this interpretation is one that favors the heart and tends to make Adams more accessible to modern readers. The 18th century man, complete with his considerations of marriage and career as distinct from love and romance, is one perhaps too alien for contemporary readers to embrace. The author, like many biographers before him, looks to sex and romance to give his readers an avenue to Adams that is familiar and also appealing. What's striking for me is the romanticization of the passages written by John Adams. And I think the comparison is particularly compelling. I hope you could follow the passage from Adams. I didn't know if I should have included a slide for that. This is something that makes for enjoyable reading. Obviously, not the John Adams passage, the earlier one. It makes for enjoyable reading. And it makes the founders come alive for us. Saying this, I recognize that I might come across as someone who's opposed to writers taking artistic license or interpretation with historical sources. I'm not opposed to the value of that approach. Indeed, I have great respect for the biographers that I discuss in the book. I am not a biographer, and I don't have those skills, certainly. But I think that it's important that we be aware of the cultural work that's being done by the final version of the story that emerges once artists and writers have interpreted the past and packaged it for modern consumers. Sometimes, as in this case, writers are working from actual documents, from John Adams' diary, for example. At other times, I was fascinated to see how historical fiction and other depictions appear largely to come from, it seems, pure imagination. The following passage illustrates this by focusing on how authors have imagined George and Martha Washington. Turn-of-the-century popular accounts rely on lore and speculation as much as the romanticized accounts published a century earlier. The introduction to a 1994 publication of the letters and writings of Martha Washington repeats a 19th century account that the courtship was romantic, quote, love at first sight. Quote, after they married, explains the author, quote, there is not a sign that George was a bored or unhappy husband. They shared a bed throughout their marriage, no separate bedrooms here, and he desired her companionship as often as possible when he was away from home during the war and presidency, end quote. A recent biography asserts, without a source of clear evidence for the claim, that Martha was, quote, the only person with whom Washington could relax and speak candidly, end quote. It further emphasizes a chemistry between them by focusing on how Martha must have felt when marrying George on the heels of her first husband, losing her first husband, whom he describes as a, quote, rather pathetic man. Quote, Martha must have felt a few tremors, as Washington must have been a breathtaking sight on his wedding day. It poignantly remarks that upon her death, Martha was, quote, almost visibly eager to join the man she had loved so long and so deeply in an eternity of happiness, end quote. Keep in mind that all of these deeply personal insights about the affective bond between Martha and George seem to come from scant few letters to analyze. As I'm sure you all are aware, Martha famously destroyed virtually all of their correspondence after his death, save for a few key letters that were accidentally kept, it seems. So here we see imagination at work, something that I found especially interesting because it is not based on trying to interpret 18th century writing for a modern audience, but rather appears to be creating a particular relationship dynamic to make the founders appear particularly appealing. And more importantly, accessible, understandable by current standards, and relatable, which is why the subtitle for the book is The American Quest for a Relatable Past. The romanticized view of George and Martha Washington has allowed Americans to point to their union and their household as foundational and as models for the country. We certainly see this in the 19th century in biography as well as portraiture. And even today we see the emphasis on that marriage as holding a powerful cultural resonance in how we understand that first family of first families and identify it with national significance. This is from a debutante ball in Texas held annually on Washington's birthday that some of you may be familiar with. It's from a documentary that was done on PBS called Las Marthas, and I have a 30-minute clip, if it can be, a 30-second clip, sorry. You should get popcorn if it's a 30-minute clip. Just a 30-second clip if we can do this technologically, and the pressure is off me because I'm not doing anything.
A picture of the first thing that your page.
There we go.
Fit into the dress.
A glorious melting of Latino and American traditions and a lavish celebration.
It's a wonderful documentary if you're interested in checking it out. I think actually the full documentary may be online at PBS. So you go back to images. The stories about that Americans, but the stories that Americans tell are not only about romanticizing the founders as happily married. There's also discomfort around the topic of sex and the founding fathers. Chapter 1, which covers George Washington, begins as follows. In 2006, a Pulitzer Prize-winning account of General Washington's early military campaign in the Revolution dazzled Americans with its heroic story. The attractive book cover, featuring a version of Lutz's famous 19th century painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, painted by one of his students, Eastman Johnson, captures in vivid color the richness of the story. The central figure of the general, standing at the front of a small boat, illustrates the valiant image of Washington that is described within the book's pages. The painting itself is a national treasure. Eastman's version of Lutz's masterpiece is an interesting choice. It alters a variety of aspects of the original, including a detail that most might not notice, the omission of Washington's ornamental watch fob, which in the original painting is gold and red, dangling closely to his crotch. Presumably for Eastman and for contemporary audiences, the object risks taking attention away from the man and the gravitas of the moment, and instead bestows it on something trivial and irrelevant, even unseemly. Eastman Johnson's copy is perhaps more in circulation today than Lutz's original. And indeed, when I started doing this, I didn't even realize there were two different versions that I was looking at, but the fob sort of gave it away initially. A 2011 special issue, this is the Johnson without the fob.
This is the Johnson without the Johnson.
The Eastman Johnson without the fob.
Without the fob.
There you go. Well, too far. This is from a 2011 special issue of Time magazine now. I'll get back, sorry, to the passage. A 2011 special issue of Time magazine devoted to the life of George Washington contains a centerfold reproduction of the famous painting, again with the fob missing, using the Eastman Johnson. Georgia school administrators might have saved themselves a headache, however, had they been able to ensure that the publisher of their textbooks went with the Johnson version instead of the original Lutz. In 1999, a Georgia school district instructed teachers' aides to erase the image of the fob by hand-painting 2,300 fifth grade textbooks. In another county, they tore the page from thousands of copies of the book. In 2002, several editions of an American history high school textbook that contains the image of Lutz's 19th century masterpiece were also altered because administrators feared that it would draw attention to this private area of Washington's body, or worse, might actually appear to be his manhood exposed. That's not my analysis, that's what they reported. Here we can see another side of sex in the Founding Fathers, the general discomfort around putting the two together. And I think in the case of Washington, because his image is as such a model American man, husband, head of household, we can see an interesting way in which artists and satirists are in fact drawn to using sexualized imagery to draw a compelling contrast between Washington as the sexless, revered, proper statesman and what is somewhat tawdry. I think this is clearly some of the energy behind the artistic license taken with Washington's image on the cover of my book. I did not design the cover. I appreciate the artist that did it, but I think it fits in this line of thinking. I'll spare you the tawdry examples. You can look them up on the web if you want. You all have access to Google. They are there, and I think it's quite striking that there are not only artists but satirists that want to make this point and use sex to make this point. There are also interesting YouTube videos that you can go and explore if you're interested. There's one called George Washington by Brad Neely that's at YouTube. A more artistic example is this mural from Cincinnati, from the Camp Washington neighborhood. The name of the mural is Campy Washington in the Camp Washington neighborhood. It plays, I think, on this contrast of Washington as the consummate general and model of American manliness by putting him limp-wristed in a dress. Has anyone seen this mural? No. It's not unlike an engraving that appeared at the end of the Revolutionary War in London, depicting Washington in a dress and mocking him. The image expressed not only gendered concerns, but also sexually charged concerns. 18th century readers were familiar with molly houses in London and other urban centers that were condemned for same-sex sexual intimacy and playful cross-dressing. So there was, even in the late 18th century, an association between cross-dressing and same-sex sexuality. Similarly, famous individuals such as the Chevalier Dion, who lived first as a man and then as a woman, were also contributing to the popularization of gender and sexuality being expressed through cross-dressing in popular media. This is actually an image that I think originated in London, but it was in fact reprinted in a Boston newspaper in the late 18th century. For the engraving of Washington, if I can go back to it, there's in fact, I may have gone too far, there is text that accompanies the engraving. So the text that accompanies this, in fact, claims that Washington is, quote, of the female sex, and it claims that his marriage with Martha was one of, quote, refined friendship. Quote, perhaps there are fewer instances in female nature of such rigid chastity, it quipped. So the practice of playing with Washington's rigid masculine image has a long history indeed. I'd like to bring in another founder to illustrate how the image of the founders has changed over time, and here's the case of Benjamin Franklin. Ben Franklin had a lot of sex. Everybody talks about it now. In 2003, Time magazine called him a babe magnet. Some estimate that he had 15 children out of wedlock. For many, this makes him cool, knowing that he lived a life that didn't conform, especially to old-fashioned morals, makes him seem all the more American and all the more modern. Or was he? The short answer is that he was very much an 18th century man, and he wasn't always viewed as ahead of his time. Previous generations viewed his personal life as downright old-fashioned. Americans today maintain a keen interest in Franklin's sex life. It's part of public curiosity about the most famous founding father never to have been a president. Franklin played a role in all of this interest, and in many ways we know what we know about him because he was more of an 18th century man than we often concede. For one thing, he contributed to the genre of racy essays that proliferated in early American print culture. Franklin's essay, Advice on the Choice of a Mistress, for example, published in Philadelphia in 1745, typifies this titillating genre. Written as a letter to a friend, the essay on the surface argues that young men should marry, a fairly traditional message. If they do not, he quips, they should choose old women over young women as lovers. In typical Franklin fashion, he lists 8 points explaining why. Number 8, the punchline as it were, states that old women make preferable lovers because, quote, they are so grateful. Choice of a Mistress and similar writings exhibit Franklin's interest as a printer in capitalizing on the public's appetite for sexually charged material. In his private life, he also produced a record that was not entirely unusual for his time and would only later become a matter of national scandal. Franklin's first child was born out of wedlock, and he never married his wife, Deborah. Franklin wasn't always viewed as a man ahead of his time. Indeed, for example, the US Senate would not endorse the House's resolution in honor of Franklin after his death. For some, the scandals that swirled around Franklin in his own lifetime became justification for characterizing him as a man of relaxed morals and thus worthy of censure by Victorian Americans. Even almost a century after his death, when a Massachusetts senator given a list of names for the National Hall of Fame, when a Massachusetts senator was given a list of names for the National Hall of Fame, he crossed out Franklin's because he was immoral. For some, Franklin was a relic of a less civilized era. Likewise, in 1869 and through the 1870s, the famed suffragist and women's rights activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave speeches that included sharp derision toward Franklin. In her speech, Home Life, she criticized Franklin for abandoning his wife in Philadelphia, having illegitimate children, disowning one of his sons, and having questionable morals in general. The less said of Franklin's private character, she said, the better. But around the same time, historians and writers began calling Franklin the first great American, the most modern, the most American of his contemporaries. In the early 20th century, one biography of Franklin was subtitled The First Civilized American. By the turn of the 20th century, the emphasis on Franklin as a modern American, as we know, relied on not only his economic self, which I think we're familiar with, but I would argue also the depiction of his intimate life. They captured the idea of Franklin as a middle-class American ahead of his time in a puritanical past. Franklin held great appeal for his down-to-earth sensibility and middle-class ease of manner. Gradually, there also emerged the depiction of Franklin as enlightened in his view of women, even a near feminist, and it fit well with the idea of him as a modern American ahead of his 18th century counterparts. Why we now view Franklin as modern instead of old-fashioned says a lot about how we view our national narrative of the history of sexuality. Historians of sexuality have long argued that the story of American sexuality isn't a simplistic arc that bends toward increased freedoms and progress for all. Yet the view of early America as especially hostile to sexual expression still stands in as our view of early American sexuality. Franklin's well-known personal history and writings stand apart from such a backdrop, thus making him appear to us now as especially modern in his approach to sex. That Franklin went from being old-fashioned for Victorian audiences to modern for today's Americans shows us that we see ourselves in our view of our founders, 15 children born out of wedlock and all. Franklin, to me, is an interesting figure in the way that he's celebrated today, especially today, for being supposedly sexually liberated and ahead of his time. I have not yet seen Sons of Liberty, but I couldn't resist including this because when I went to the movies last weekend, they had a preview actually for the History Channel series, which I'm sure some of you have seen, and up came Benjamin Franklin as the womanizer, and so I went and found this and thought, well, I've got to include that in the talk. There's a few things that strike me about it. One is that somehow the womanizer is clearly meant to be not a good thing, but something that seems to be a good thing, though. I mean, they're clearly going to celebrate Franklin. I haven't seen that the series does that with him, but I couldn't imagine that they were in fact going to rake him over the coals as a womanizer in this series. So how many people have seen the Sons of Liberty series? Okay. Well, maybe in the Q&A you can tell me how he comes across as a womanizer. For me, it becomes interesting to see how Franklin's 18th century relationships with women become the subject of great scrutiny, with a focus on which relationships were consummated and which ones were not, despite the inability for us to know such things. It also raises for me the problem of attaching great weight to consummation of a relationship as a way to truly understand that relationship and the people in it. The did he or didn't he question can be an important one, but it often takes on a life of its own. It doesn't only apply to Franklin, as you know. And the ways in which writers and artists sometimes go out on limbs to make definitive cases one way or the other, especially in some areas where evidence is lacking, never ceases to hold my attention and get me thinking about the cultural work that's being done by the various answers that get produced for those questions. I'd like to add yet another founder to the discussion. I'd like to share a few different passages from the chapter on Gouverneur Morris to give you a sense of that portion of the book. Morris spent much of his life in New York, where he was born in 1752 and died in 1816. Despite his many significant contributions to the founding of the nation, Morris has never enjoyed mainstream popularity. While still in his 20s, he signed the Articles of Confederation, served in the Constitutional Congress in 78 and 79, he represented Pennsylvania at the Constitutional Convention of 87, and served as minister to France from 1792 to 1794. In 1800, he served as a Federalist in the U.S. Senate for the state of New York. He closed his illustrious public career as chairman of the Erie Canal Commission from 1810 to 1813. Morris lived much of his life as a bachelor, enjoying sexual relationships with married and unmarried women, and marrying only at the age of 57. Unlike other founders, Morris left extensive and explicit diaries that reflect on his intimate life. No such documents survive the other founders, nor do we know whether any of them wrote anything comparable. In his diaries, Morris writes about sexual behavior in a way that emphasizes the pleasure that he shared with a married woman in Paris, his main premarital relationship, and fashions it as cosmopolitan and enlightened. Morris expresses a certain degree of pride in his lifestyle, a sense of satisfaction at his ability to combine sexual, romantic, commercial, and political concerns. Typical of the founder's generation, Morris's writings reveal an attitude towards sexual relations that is unencumbered by the traditional moral framework that would dominate the culture of his 19th and even 20th century biographers. In his own lifetime, Morris was the subject of humor coupled with mild derision. In a classical reference to his sexual appetite, John Jay, for example, once quipped that, quote, "Gouverneur is daily employed in making oblations to Venus." Morris's diaries express a certain enjoyment at mixing business and official affairs with clandestine sexual moments. In one entry, for example, he records taking advantage of a moment when he was alone with Madame de Flahaut. Quote, "We seized the opportunity," end quote. The following month, he writes of a particular moment that the two shared. After discussing land purchasing policies in America to shed light on how private property might be preserved, given the circumstances of the French Revolution, he attended a dinner party at the Louvre. When his lover's husband went to another room after dinner, Morris stayed behind with the ladies. Shortly thereafter, the women also left him and his lover alone. He wrote, quote, "And immediately I take Madame on my lap, and at the imminent risk of discovery, by 2 doors and 1 window, perform the act. I think of all others, Monsieur would be least pleased to behold." End quote. In a number of entries, Morris writes about engaging in sexual relations in the presence of others, unbeknownst to them. A dinner at the Louvre with Adele and Mademoiselle Duplessis resulted in the following entry. Quote, "After dinner, while the latter is playing the forte piano, as she is nearsighted, we almost perform the genial act." In another, shall I stop? Is this too much?
No way.
In another example, he writes, quote, "We performed the act at dusk in the presence of Mademoiselle." In another entry, he writes, quote, "Go to the Louvre, and being disappointed in the expectation of a clear stage, Madame is so well disposed that we take the chance of interruption and celebrate in the passage while Mademoiselle is at the harpsichord in the drawing room. The husband is below. Visitors are hourly expected. The doors are all open." End quote. Morris uses an unusually large vocabulary for describing his intimate relations with women. The extent of his vocabulary demonstrates to himself, this is his diary after all, his sophistication. Some of his terms simply dislocate sexual intimacy from romantic love, focusing on the mechanics of pleasurable erotic interactions. In one entry, for example, he writes, quote, "We perform the usual exercises." In another, he writes, "We performed certain gesticulations." Often he refers to doing the act or the operation, as in, "After dinner we embrace to mutual satisfaction, and in a few minutes repeat the operation." As the above passage illustrates, mutual pleasure was important, and very often Morris's vocabulary demonstrates a pleasure that is rooted in the joy shared equally by intimates. In Morris's diaries, sexual intimacy is venerated as a mystery or as a gift passed down from the ancients. This reference to the Greeks and Romans is typical of his era's reverence for that culture. For example, he writes that we, quote, celebrate the mysteries. We celebrate, we pay our adorations. Very often he writes of, quote, Cyprian mysteries, Cyprian rites, of joining in fervent adoration to the Cyprian queen. References to the Cyprian queen, or versions thereof, speak to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of Eros, which again emphasizes physical and sexual attraction, not love in a romantic sense, but sexuality and eroticism. For Victorian and even 20th century writers, this approach to sexual expression outside marriage would complicate celebration of Morris's legacy. Yet there was, of course, an easy solution. Unlike today, in earliest depictions, he was simply cast as a social bachelor. It would not be until 1939 that Americans would be able to glimpse Morris's personal life, and even then, few would do so. Anne Carey Davenport, Morris's great-granddaughter, edited and published a 2-volume set of his writings that have become some of the most famous observations of the French Revolution by an American. Although few individuals had access to edited volumes of personal diary entries, and this was certainly no popular work of biography, the Davenport volumes really paved the way and made available to later biographers Morris's revealing and explicit diaries. The original manuscript diaries themselves had been defaced by someone seeking to shape public memory of Morris by preventing some of what he wrote from ever being seen. Who knows what this talk would contain if they hadn't done that?
Wow.
In several places, the Davenport transcription preserves words now lost from the original manuscript record. So apparently Davenport was able to either see through the scribbling, but she has a few words that she's included that appear to have been crossed out. In some cases, only 1 or 2 words have been crossed out. On April 15, 1791, for example, Morris writes, "Shortly after dinner, I go to the Louvre and we celebrate." Whoever defaced the original diary understood his sexual code and scribbled out the word celebrate. His having ever written it now only evidenced by Davenport's transcription. In other places, several lines have been obliterated, as you can see from the image. In one instance, 22 lines of the diary were carefully crossed out, and in 1 or 2 places, several pages have been torn from the diary, lost forever. I hope this excerpt from the chapter on Morris gives you a sense of how his depictions change over time, but also how his diary makes him an unusual founder in comparison to the others. I'd like to share with you the final paragraph of the book, which points to one of the larger points that I hope to make with the project. This book, with its examination of how Americans have created and recreated the sexual histories of the most famous of the political leaders of the American Revolution, shows how sex has long been a component of civic and national identity. It should also challenge us to avoid superficially characterizing the complex personal lives of famous individuals, including political leaders today. And it should make us ask ourselves what we're hoping to accomplish by mobilizing familiar tropes and stock depictions of romantic life. Such portrayals draw on a centuries-old history in America of connecting personal to public personas, and often rest on a host of stereotypes informed by a range of prescribed characteristics. By focusing on how cultural constructions of the intimate lives of the founders, this book challenges how we configure sex and gender in our public evaluations of prominent Americans, and perhaps should also give us pause about private considerations of ourselves and each other. What future generations will make of these men and their private lives remains to be seen, but given the long-time interest in this aspect of their lives, one thing seems certain. They will take an interest in the men's private lives, but those private lives, as remembered by future generations, will likely not be the ones we know today. Finally, given that we're at this extraordinary place, I'd like to conclude by turning to the issues that face many home museums like Mount Vernon. That is not Mount Vernon. There's an article by a public historian, Jennifer Tabersi, that raises an interesting point about the implicit narratives that are often told by museums, and she's not talking about home museums, this is just about museums, about normative and deviant sexual behavior and cultures. It's provocatively titled, "All Museums Are Sex Museums." If you're not too put off by the title, then I think it's easy enough for us to agree that when broad stories are told about histories, there are always choices being made about what elements to include and what drops out of those narratives. We see this very issue at work in controversies over history textbooks that get caught up in culture wars. I think the point of the article has important implications for home museums and can get us thinking about what stories home museums tell about personal life and what stories are left untold. Biographies are certainly able to address many more complexities in their pages, as can film or TV if it so chooses. Home museums, which are important sources of information for Americans about historic figures, are perhaps more limited in their ability to broach private life broadly. So often the power of place reinforces an overarching theme of domesticity that has very strong resonance with Americans and comes with a host of assumptions of private life and behavior that's very often idealized and romanticized. As such, I have a lot of respect for those who work in this area and who take seriously the task of creating places like Mount Vernon and interacting with the public as they seek to convey that information and those life stories. Like the stories about the founders' personal lives, Mount Vernon is, of course, more than George Washington and Martha Washington's home, and it tells more than the story of their lives. It tells the story of American history, indeed, of Americanness. Thank you again for coming out on such a cold evening, and I look forward to a discussion and some questions. Thank you.
Okay. Bob, thank you very much. I thought we were going to be okay, and then you got to the Gouverneur Morris part. So I blush a little bit. You're the perfect straight man to read that. We didn't talk about the scoundrel Jefferson, of course. We didn't, his intimacies, very much a part of the way he's understood now, and really the transition of the last 25 years of the way Jefferson is understood. It's sort of complete 180-degree revolution with evolution. So talk a little bit about Jefferson and the way Americans are sort of coming to grips with his sexual life at Monticello.
Yeah, Jefferson is a fascinating example, basically, of how these stories change over time. So in the chapter on Jefferson, I don't focus on paternity, which I think has probably been the focus of many discussions of late. I'm sure you're all aware in terms of paternity with Sally Hemings, of her children, that relationship. What I really focused on and became fascinated by was how people describe the dynamic of that relationship. What was that relationship like? And what sources do we have to understand that relationship? Was it an abusive relationship? Was it exploitive? She was enslaved by him after all. Was it love across the color line? You know, there's any number of directions I think the person could go in trying to understand that relationship. As you are probably aware, there's almost no documentation, virtually no documentation about the nature of that relationship. So I think the best academic work on the relationship right now is looking at the length of the relationship, that it seems to have occurred over a period of decades. And so that length of time stands in for a generally positive relationship. I don't know, if that's really enough to sort of support that conclusion. But there's really so little to go on that I became fascinated in the depictions of their relationship that really acted as if there was, in fact, a lot of information to go on. And so you may be familiar with popular films about Jefferson and Sally Hemings. There is, I think, a real romanticization of that relationship that's in some circles taken place that depicts it as a love story, love across the color line, a relationship that if it could only have taken place in another time and place would have blossomed and grown, but because of slavery really, there's now even I think a storyline that describes Jefferson himself as being sort of a victim of his time and circumstances. So I became fascinated with it. I think that's why I ended up saying that this idea of him as a multicultural hero, which is a phrase that others have used to describe him, because there's a way in which, if we're describing the relationship in that way, then it does seem to stand in for an American story of breaking those rules and of cross-cultural relationships of cultures combining. That is very American. There's another side, of course, of the story that could be told that perhaps the relationship was exploitive. I mean, virtually all of the scholarship on relations between masters and enslaved women tends to emphasize exploitation and assault, and that is sort of the assumption that the power dynamic is there. And so
there's very few.
Yeah.
There's very few that don't emphasize that. And those
Sure,
are
right.
These strange relationships where a master will, marry one of his slaves, but those are, extremely rare. You're absolutely right. I mean, the heavy emphasis is on exploitation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think, when the Hemming story started first coming out, at least its most recent first coming out, right, it has been out always, essentially. I mean, it came out in his lifetime. So when it, again, took on new traction most recently, there was, I think, a lot of concern that this was going to undo Jefferson's standing, his stature, expose him as a hypocrite or as an exploiter. And show ultimately that the American experiment is rotten to the core, right? It's an experiment based on hypocrisy and exploitation, and I don't think we've seen that. I think I don't do a lot of quantitative analysis in the book, but I think studies are showing that Jefferson is as popular as ever, and certainly Monticello and other sort of very prominent public tellings of the story have embraced Jefferson as a man. Multicultural hero is sort of a pretty provocative way of putting it, but it's along those lines essentially, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's a favorable.
Yeah, and I remember the late '90s and the defenses of Jefferson that were laid out there. I think a lot of people were shocked that essentially there wasn't this big revulsion. It's been more of a sense of, oh, we understand him better.
Right.
He's no longer this sphinx. He can be God,
Right.
in some way. This ability to get at the founders through this intimacy that they have. Now, so I'm, expected to ask the hard-hitting academic questions here. So I want to kick off open this up to group discussion with this one, which is, did George Washington have intimate relations with that woman, Sally Fairfax? Yeah. What's the answer?
I can't answer that question. How about Lewinsky? I didn't. One thing I did not do in the book, which I think a lot of people find unsatisfying, is that I did not study the sex lives of the founding fathers. Right? I mean, my interest was really in studying the stories that people have told about their private lives, because I was really interested in what it stands in for.
Let's get a question from the audience. Ken Bowling in the back. Wait for the microphone because we're trying to stream this online, and we want to hear what you're asking. So, Michael will run around. I'll try to get people up here.
I want to pontificate for 30 seconds before I ask my question. When Thomas Jefferson's wife died after childbirth, she made him promise her that he would never marry again because she didn't want their children raised by a stepmother. And so 10 years after her death, he began a 40-year relationship with her enslaved half-sister. And I think that is the key to that relationship. And she must have looked, she was 75% Caucasian. She must have looked a lot like Martha. My question deals with how you treat homosexuality in that generation. I'm a historian of the creation of the founding of the federal government. I've written about 3 men who had clearly male-centric lives, Frederick von Steuben, Peter L'Enfant, and Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, the infant, Lewis and Clark expedition. Yet I'm reluctant to use the term homosexual because it didn't exist. The lifestyle didn't exist. Certainly L'Enfant and Charbonneau both had children. But yet I'm really convinced they had sexual relationships with men. And I don't want to get involved in the debate over you can't say this, you can't say that because the word didn't exist. But how do you, as a scholar of sexuality, deal with that?
It's a great question. I think I'm immediately thinking of where I was saying that the did he or didn't he question weighs heavily. So that's not only limited to Franklin. It also is a question that historians of same-sex sexuality have wrestled with for some time. It's interesting to me. This comes up in the book in the Hamilton chapter, for example. So there are love letters between Hamilton and Lawrence. And in fact, I believe we have more documented love expressed between the two of them than documented love expressed between George and Martha Washington. to take an example of what do we do documentation of, right? And I think that's a provocative thing to say, but when you weigh the documents, that's what you've got. And so I became quite interested then in how those stories are told or not told, and not simply by people that are caught up in sort of the academic debates over what can I say before a term is invented or not, but sort of by a reluctance to fan that into a romance, although people are clearly saying they love each other at that point. So I don't know if this answers your question or not, but I mean, as an historian of sexuality, I am like any other historian. I'm rooted to documented sources. And so in the absence of sources that depict a sexually intimate relationship, there's not much a person can do without that documentation. In the presence of documented love between members of the same sex, I think people should address that as what it is, which is love between members of the same sex. That's different than saying it's love between straight members of the same sex or gay members of the same sex. If you can, in theory, as an historian, sort of bracket both, assumptions or conclusions, right, and just sort of go with what you have, then you have a loving bond that existed between Hamilton and Lawrence. So I think that's a fairly conservative way of operating as an historian, but that's essentially how I would operate, based on what you have documentation of.
Thank you.
Stick to the evidence, Ken. That's the answer. If it doesn't say they're having sex, who knows?
But who knows is different than they're not.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, and I think that particularly in gay history, particularly there's been a burden of, if it doesn't say they're having sex, then they are presumed to be heterosexual. And so a lot of historians of sexuality have said there's sort of an unfair burden there placed on gay history. The presumption is straight until proven otherwise with documentation.
Right. If there is a book coming out that's going to be about the gay founders that is in the works right now.
Yeah, I think Larry Kramer is working on a book for some time now. We'll see.
So look forward to that future book talk. Yes, ma'am, right here. Wait for the microphone is coming around from Stephen McLeod.
Larry Kramer.
Sometimes I feel that writers misinterpret writings of the previous generations, because so many letters are so beautifully written that don't imply sex or same sex at all. And I'm just wondering, not too long ago, somebody came out and said Eleanor Roosevelt had a gay relationship with I forget who else it was.
Lorena Hickok.
But, the way they wrote, today people don't know how to write. They don't write like that. If you go up to Gettysburg in the museum and you see the letters that soldiers wrote their wives during the war, they're absolutely beautiful letters. And and they profess a love, often a profound state of love, which does not imply sex for sex's sake as we know it today.
Right.
And I'm just wondering how many people misinterpret that or want to read into it something different, like Abraham Lincoln. He offered, people, if you go down to Gadsby's Tavern and you go into the museum there and they tell you how many people were sleeping in one room or in one bed, thankful that they weren't sleeping on the ground somewhere. I don't think it was unusual to offer a half a bed to somebody. I mean, Ben Franklin and John Adams had to sleep in the same bed in France. Neither one were too happy about that. But, Lincoln offered his young lieutenant, when there's no other bed, the other half of his bed. Why should we think that was a homosexual affair?
Yeah, this is a wonderful point, and it builds on this very question of documentation. So it's not only the documentation, but it's the documentation in its own context. And so it's not just the words, but how people were writing at the time, for example. And I think you're absolutely right that people do read a lot into the prose of the 18th century. I think reading the mail of 18th century individuals, letters of 18th century individuals, there's nothing simple or straightforward about it. But I would also broaden that out to not only being about same-sex relations, but also relations between men and women. And so when you think about Franklin's writings to women, for example, were often written in a particular style of the day, right? That is, it's stylized, it's romanticized, it's playful in its use of language. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a heartfelt love there or a heartfelt sexual relationship there. It's difficult to read too much into 18th century writing. I think it's a great point.
Yes, sir, right here. We insist in the scholar's residence that each scholar has their own bed.
Now you tell me. I stayed here last night.
I did my bachelor's degree at Franklin Marshall College. When Franklin College was founded in 1787, supposedly it was named after Franklin because he had made a very large contribution. But one of the stories around it after that is that he missed the dedication of the college because he stopped off in York, Pennsylvania, and the whorehouses, and wasn't able to get up in time to make the dedication. Do you know if there's any truth to that story?
No, and I wish you had told me this story before I wrote the book. It's another great example, right, of the kinds of stories that are told.
The revised version.
Revised version.
Second edition. Absolutely. And speaking of which, where's Jenny Madison and Dolly Madison? I mean, come on. The first couple of love. I mean, where were they?
I mean, there's a number of others, I think, who could have figured in the book. So there was an effort to keep the book affordable and concise, and not bore people with chapter after chapter. There was originally a draft of a chapter on Burr, which never really fully got developed. You could do one on Madison. I think there are plenty of other sort of non-founders that could also figure. My initial intention in Morris sort of messed this up, but I couldn't resist Morris, was to use only the icons, because I wanted to write about public memory, not just what's going on in the stories of people that have studied sort of lesser second or third tier founders. So I wanted to do the people that represented the American founding to ordinary Americans. And so people like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin had to be in there. Morris is not as well known, in fact, unknown by most Americans, I would think, through the 19th and 20th centuries, unknown today by most Americans. And so he doesn't quite fit in that mode, but I mean, the diaries were so explicit that I wanted to use him as sort of an example and a benchmark of what could be done with diaries.
For people who don't know, Morris was also one-legged, right?
That's right.
And he was incredibly adept. Given that he only had one leg.
Well, this is what people always say, and I became interested in that also because his disability becomes yoked to his sexuality somehow in a way that you'll see this. To pick on you for a second, you'll see this yoking done in one breath. It's mentioned that he is sexually disabled and sexually active, or that it didn't inhibit him. And I found that fascinating. There's a number of ways in which depictions of the body or normal bodies come up in all the stories, and so that's sort of a thread through the book. I tried not to throw too much into this talk, but that's another thread. And of course, it's interesting.
Swan, I am. Okay, so yes. Over here, yes, ma'am. Mike is coming with the question.
This is an anecdotal story. I went to St. Kitts 2 years ago, and on the island I went to, the notable places, and I was shocked. I think it was John Hancock. I went to one of his plantations, and I found out he was an illegitimate son.
No, Hamilton.
Or Hamilton.
Hamilton.
And it's like, Hamilton was illegitimate. I mean, this is one of our founding fathers, and he was a big, a big aha moment for me. It's like, okay, John Hamilton was illegitimate. How many others were like of this illegitimacy that were a part of the founding fathers? And then I found out Jefferson's family was part of this whole St. Kitts, slave trade. His family was part of this, and it just made me realize, that we have no knowledge of the sexuality of our founding fathers and how it's been whitewashed, and how someone that we think of as one of our big notable historical figures was illegitimate, and how many other are illegitimate.
I think this is a great example of how, I mentioned that sex figures is a way, or private life figures is a way to connect contemporary Americans to an 18th century past that's really very remote, right? With very foreign ideas about the body, about marriage, about equality, about sexuality. I mean, that is a place that is very hard for us to relate to, the late 18th century. But when we talk about how they loved just like we did, or just like we do, or they lost, had heartbreak, they become much more relatable. I think something else that goes on, though, in terms of feeling like you're peeling back the truth, right, or getting at finding the truth behind some story that's been whitewashed, is that sex is sort of figuring as this way of getting at true history, right, the true American history. And somehow, if you find out that Hamilton was in fact born in wedlock, we've learned some core truth about ourselves. I think that's putting an awful lot on sex and sexuality, but that is what fascinated me, and that sort of cultural work that's occurring there. So, Adams talks about this at the time. It's funny because almost every story that's sort of circulating now circulated in their own lifetimes. And so Adams refers to Hamilton as a bastard brat, as people probably are familiar.
Yeah.
So, it's funny how stories sort of come out and then get covered up again so that people feel like it's been whitewashed and rediscover it. And there's a real power to that feeling like you're rediscovering this truth.
And there's a new play that's opening in New York about Hamilton that we talked about briefly, but the author of the play is a hip-hop artist in the broad sense, who his father is an immigrant from the West Indies. Hamilton is a West Indian immigrant, bastard child who grows in the streets of New York City, and he's reinterpreting Hamilton's life, was inspired by reading Chernow's Hamilton. That story of Hamilton's roots was an important one to make this sort of intimate connection with Hamilton in a way that makes him much more contemporarily relevant. You know the work I'm...
Yeah, I haven't seen this. I don't even think it's out yet, but I've seen the early reviews. I mean, this kind of psychologizing about Hamilton or about the other founders is something that really takes place in the early 20th century, and it really is sort of a Freudian influence on this idea of early childhood development, early youth development. It's when, in the early 20th century, is when we start to get a real emphasis placed on young love that the founders experience before they get married, in a way to show that their youthful development is normal, is healthy. It can go the other way in terms of how his status being born out of wedlock could have scarred him, or at least motivates him in certain ways in his adult life. So even though Adams mentions this early on, it's not really something that's psychologized about Hamilton through the 19th century. That's something that really happens in the early 20th century. There's a few other hands, so maybe if we can...
Right here at
first time.
Steve.
I think the play is at the Public Theater in New York, and about Hamilton, I just think he's amazing, and his appreciation for trade and the importance of the Caribbean at the time, and how he accomplished so much at such a young age to overcome whatever it was he overcame. But I'm sort of wondering, like Hamilton and some of the other founding fathers, how much of it is a uniquely American sexuality? You can say that because of the, there were here pioneers, independent fighters, thinkers. Is there a broad paintbrush that you can say because?
I mean, in terms of the lives they actually lead?
Yeah.
I think people would actually argue, I think maybe many more people argue that it's in fact European influences, especially for the elites, that there is such a longer elite or aristocratic tradition of, libertinism, for example, or sex out of wedlock, or more freer sex as a privilege of being elite or aristocratic. So I think other people have argued sort of perhaps that's the vein that this stems from. I think there's all kinds of ways in which the American context matters, though. You could take Jefferson Ford example, right? That context of slavery plays a vitally important role in his experiences.
Come on, Americans do it better than the rest. All right. Let's have two more here. Anyone on this side?
That's the answer.
And let's go with the gentleman in back and then in the middle.
I understand that Martha Washington named her tomcat Hamilton.
No, never has.
I've heard that also. I'm not sure of the source for that, but I'd also heard that as well.
Historians can usually cite some person said this. I don't know of a reference for that. Right in the middle here. Like this gentleman.
You said you specialized in the study of masculinity, study of the 18th century. Did you look into why George Washington's biography omits any sort of masculine influence on his early life? The only person to stress the importance of the father of his life is his first biographer, Mason Weems. Yeah. Otherwise, male influence is completely written out of all the subsequent biographies, and instead they stress the mother and the wife. There's several biographies of Martha, a couple of his wives involved, but of the men, the four men most central to his formation of his life and his character, which would be his father, his older brother Lawrence, Lawrence's father-in-law William Fairfax, and Lord Fairfax. There's only a biography of one man.
It's an interesting observation. I hadn't noticed this. I mean, I was aware of how Weems writes about his father in sort of the same way that people write about Washington in terms of greatness, right? Extraordinary manliness, basically, right? I had not noticed this. I should have spoken with you before I wrote the book also.
It's an interesting observation. There is, I think, a dearth of biographies on the male figures in Washington's life. I don't think I'd go so far as to say that most biographers don't emphasize male role models. Douglas Southall Freeman certainly does. Chernow certainly makes a big emphasis on Lawrence in his life. But you're right, there is a lot less known about those guys.
There are no biographies.
Yeah, and very few biographies. Yes, one last question, Joe Dooley in the back.
Actually, it's not a question as much as a comment. This compilation of papers called Sons of the Father, and it's about Washington's influence on various of his proteges. There's an essay in that compilation called by Fred Anderson, and he talks about Washington's mentors. He talks about Washington's father, his brothers, the Fairfaxes, and in fact the influence that these men have on Washington's development and his sense of himself, his sense of manliness, his sense of leadership. So look up Sons of the Father and look for Fred Anderson's essay.
Well, it's a good way to end. We're coming up on a romantic weekend. Remember, manliness, leadership, it's all involved, and good luck to everyone doing the operation. Let's all give Tom right through the door in the back, and then Professor Foster will be up here in the front signing them. We don't let him leave until everybody is signed, so please buy these books. It's a great Valentine's Day gift.